March 1951. Malayan jungle. A patrol of 7 men lay flat behind a rotting teak log.
Hide!
Breath held, eyes wide. They should have been walking into an ambush. 40 yards ahead, where the trail bent toward a stream crossing, guerrilla fighters waited in the undergrowth with rifles raised, ready to tear them apart. But the patrol never arrived. They were 500 yards back, frozen in position, every weapon aimed toward the thickest part of the canopy, because 10 minutes earlier they had heard something, a sound so faint, so absurd, that if you mention it later in any official report, you would be laughed out of the briefing room. Tap, 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 a pattern, metallic, rhythmic, coming from the tin roof of a compound dwelling half a mile behind enemy lines. If stories like this vanish, so does the truth about how wars are really won. Subscribe. Keep the forgotten battles alive. Corporal James Hawk crouched at the base of a rubber tree, sweat soaking through his jungle greens, listening. The sound came again. Tap, tap, pause, tap, then silence. He turned to the man beside him and whispered one word. Ambush. The patrol reversed course without a shot fired. 3 hours later, intelligence confirmed guerrilla movement along that exact stream crossing. The trap had been set. It was never sprung. And the reason had nothing to do with radios, air reconnaissance, or encrypted messages. It had everything to do with a 34-year-old Malay plantation worker named Osman bin Latif, a man who had never held a weapon in his life, and a code he had invented using nothing but the corrugated tin roof of his family home. This is the story of how a mocked, dismissed, and ridiculed warning system saved 3 British patrols from certain death during the Malayan emergency, and why no one in command wanted to admit it worked. Osman bin Latif was born in 1917 in a compound near Batagaja, Perak, on the western edge of the Malayan jungle. His father tapped rubber. His mother sold vegetables at the morning market. Osman grew up in a world shaped by rhythm. The thud of the tapping knife against rubber bark. The patter of monsoon rain on tin roofing. The cadence of Malay spoken in short, tonal bursts. He learned early that sound carried meaning, and that meaning could travel farther than a shout if you knew how to shape it. He was 12 when he first experimented with tapping codes on the underside of a metal water drum, using patterns to signal his younger brother across the plantation without alerting the foreman. It was a game, nothing more, but it planted something in his mind, an understanding that sound could be structure, that rhythm could be language. His childhood was not exceptional. He attended a missionary school for 3 years, learned basic English and arithmetic, then left to work the rubber trees alongside his father. The work was brutal. Pre-dawn starts, the slash of the tapping knife, the collection of latex in tin cups hung from scarred bark. His hands developed calluses. His back learned to bend for hours without complaint. But his mind stayed sharp. He listened to everything. The way the British plantation managers spoke to each other versus how they spoke to the workers. The way the Chinese shopkeepers negotiated prices in 3 languages. The way the Malay elders settled disputes with carefully chosen words and long silences. He understood that communication was power, and that the most effective communication was often the least obvious. By his 20s, Osman had married a woman named Amina from a neighboring compound. They had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. He built a small house on the edge of the plantation, using salvaged timber and a corrugated tin roof purchased from a Chinese merchant in Ipoh. The roof was cheap, thin, prone to rust and leaks. But it was his, and it made a specific sound when rain fell, a sharp, metallic patter that carried across the clearing. Osman noticed that sound traveled differently depending on wind direction, humidity, and the density of the jungle canopy. He noticed that certain rhythms cut through ambient noise while others blended in. He filed these observations away, without knowing why they mattered. They would matter later. By 1948, the world Osman knew began to fracture. The Malayan Communist Party, driven underground after failed negotiations with the British colonial government, launched an armed insurgency. What the British would call Malayan emergency was, in reality, a full-scale guerrilla war. The jungle became a battlefield. Plantations were raided. Infrastructure was sabotaged. Isolated police posts were overrun. The communists operated with brutal efficiency, moving through the compound system like ghosts, demanding food, loyalty, and silence. Those who refused paid in blood. Those who complied lived under constant suspicion from the British. There was no neutral ground, no safe position, only the narrow, treacherous space between two armies, where survival depended on reading signals, keeping secrets, and knowing when to speak and when to vanish. By 1950, Malaya was burning. The communist insurgency, led by the Malaya National Liberation Army, had turned the jungle into a war zone. Guerrilla fighters ambushed convoys, sabotaged infrastructure, and melted back into the green. British forces responded with patrols, relocation programs, and sweeps through contested areas. Osman's compound sat on the edge of controlled territory, a thin line between government presence and insurgent influence. He saw both sides. He spoke to both sides. And he understood with brutal clarity that his family's survival depended on making himself useful without becoming a target. He could not fight. He could not inform openly. But he could listen, and he could tap. The communist fighters came at night. They did not announce themselves. They simply appeared, moving through the compound in silence, taking food, asking questions, and making it clear that cooperation was not optional. Osman gave them rice. He answered their questions with carefully neutral responses. He did not volunteer information, but he did not resist either. Resistance meant death. The guerrillas operated with ruthless efficiency. Informants were executed publicly. Families suspected of collaboration were burned out. Osman watched a neighboring compound lose 4 men to a single night of reprisals, their bodies left hanging from trees as a warning. He learned to speak without saying anything, to see without appearing to watch, to exist in the narrow space between compliance and betrayal. The British patrols came during the day. They were younger, louder, less familiar with the terrain. They asked the same questions the guerrillas asked, but with less subtlety and more suspicion. Osman gave them tea. He answered their questions with the same carefully neutral responses. He did not volunteer information about the guerrillas, because if he did, the guerrillas would know. The compound was too small to hide secrets, too exposed to protect informants. And the British could not stay. They came for a few hours, asked their questions, and left. The guerrillas stayed in the jungle, watching, waiting, and remembering. Osman understood the calculus. The British could offer a temporary protection. The guerrillas could offer permanent consequences. But there was a third option, a way to help without being seen to help. A method that required no meetings, no exchanges, no evidence. Just sound, just rhythm, just a man on a roof with a stone in his hand. The first time he tried it, he expected nothing. A British patrol had passed through the compound 2 days earlier, led by a young lieutenant named Greaves who spoke broken Malay and carried a folding map that was already rotting from humidity. Greaves had asked the village headman if there was guerrilla activity nearby. The headman had said no, because saying yes meant reprisals from the insurgents, and saying nothing meant suspicion from the British. Osman had watched the exchange and felt the weight of the lie. That night, he heard movement in the jungle, voices, the clink of metal on metal. He knew what it meant. The guerrillas were positioning themselves along the trail the patrol would use on their return. He could not run to warn them. He could not send a messenger. But his house sat 300 yards from the trail, and the wind carried sound. He climbed onto the roof. The tin was old, patched with rust and bent nails. He took a palm-sized river stone and began to tap. 3 slow strikes. Pause. 2 fast strikes. Pause. 3 slow again. He repeated it for 90 seconds, then climbed down and went inside. He did not know if anyone had heard. He did not know if anyone would understand. He only knew that he had tried. The next morning, the patrol returned by a different route. Greaves mentioned it to the headman in passing. They had heard something unusual during the night, a rhythmic sound from the compound. One of the men thought it might be a warning. The headman shrugged and said it was probably a loose sheet of roofing in the wind. Greaves accepted the explanation, but Osman saw the look in his eyes. Curiosity, not dismissal. Not yet. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Another patrol, another night of guerrilla movement. Osman climbed the roof and tapped. This time, the pattern was different. 4 fast strikes. Pause. 1 slow. Pause. Repeat. He had no formal code. No training. He was inventing as he went, using instinct and the logic of rhythm. Fast meant urgency. Slow meant direction. Repetition meant certainty. The patrol, led by a sergeant named Booth, heard it. Booth was older, more experienced, more paranoid. He halted his men and sent 2 scouts forward. They found fresh footprints and disturbed foliage near a choke point along the trail. Booth pulled his patrol back and called in a different route through company headquarters. No contact was made. No ambush was sprung. And when Booth returned to base, he mentioned the tin roof sound in his report. That is when the mockery started. Officers in the command post laughed. They called it the tin roof sound signal. They joked that Osmond was a superstitious local banging on metal to scare away evil spirits. One major suggested it was probably a monkey. Another said it was Booth's imagination, a case of jungle fatigue, an auditory hallucination. The report was filed and ignored. But Booth was not the kind of man who ignored patterns. He sought out Greaves. The 2 compared notes. Same compound, same roof, same avoidance of ambush. Booth went back to the village and spoke directly to Osmond through a Malay-speaking corporal. He asked one question. "Are you the one tapping?" Osmond hesitated, then nodded. Booth asked why. Osmond said, "Because the other way, you die. And I die too." Booth understood immediately. Osmond was trapped between 2 forces. If he informed openly, the guerrillas would kill him and his family. If he stayed silent, the British would lose trust in the compound and collective punishment would follow. The tin roof code was his compromise. Deniable, subtle, a message that could be dismissed as coincidence or environment, but specific enough to be useful if someone chose to listen. Booth asked him to explain the patterns. Osmond did his best. He had no written system, no chart. He described what each rhythm meant in terms of direction, urgency, and estimated number. Booth took notes. He did not tell his superiors. He told his men, and he told 2 other patrol leaders he trusted. The system was absurdly simple. 3 slow taps meant guerrilla presence detected, low urgency, movement away from British routes. 4 fast taps meant guerrilla presence detected, moderate urgency, movement toward potential ambush positions. 6 fast taps in rapid succession meant imminent threat, high certainty, abort planned movement. Long pauses between patterns indicated direction. Tap sequences on the left side of the roof meant north or northwest. Right side meant south or southeast. Center meant the trail itself was compromised. Osmond had developed this entirely through trial, intuition, and an acute sense of how sound moved through the jungle at night. He tested on his own children first, tapping patterns and asking them to identify meaning. They learned quickly. He refined the code, made it sharper, more distinct, and then he waited for the next patrol. The 3rd patrol was led by Lieutenant Harrow, a recent transfer from a mechanized unit who had little jungle experience and even less patience for what he called native folklore. When Booth briefed him on the tin roof system, Harrow dismissed it outright. He said it was irresponsible to rely on unverified signals from an unvetted civilian. He said it encouraged superstition and eroded discipline. He said if Booth brought it up again, he would file a formal complaint. Booth said nothing, but he made sure his own patrol stayed alert for sound. And he made sure Osmond knew that someone was listening. April 1951. Harrow's patrol moved through contested territory near Sungay Sipit, an area thick with insurgent activity. Osmond's compound was 600 yards west of their planned route. The night before patrol departed, Osmond heard voices again, closer this time, more organized. He recognized one voice, a guerrilla leader known to locals as Ahmad, a former schoolteacher turned fighter who controlled movement through that grid. Osmond knew what was coming. He climbed the roof. This time, he used a sequence he had never tried before. 6 fast strikes, long pause, 6 fast strikes again. Continuous repetition for 3 minutes. It was the most aggressive pattern he had ever used. It meant imminent danger, multiple hostiles, high certainty. Harrow's patrol heard it. The men looked at each other. One corporal mentioned Booth's briefing. Harrow ordered silence and kept moving. He believed it was coincidence, superstition, a waste of attention. They continued along the planned route. 15 minutes later, they reached a narrow defile between two ridges where the trail funneled into a natural kill zone. Harrow gave the order to proceed. The lead scout moved forward, and then the world exploded. Gunfire erupted from three sides. Grenades detonated in the center of the column. Harrow went down in the first seconds, hit twice in the chest. 2 men were killed outright. The rest scattered, returned fire, and fought their way back through a gauntlet of ambush positions. They survived only because a quick reaction force heard the firefight and moved in with armored support. But the damage was done. 3 dead, 5 wounded, and a lieutenant who had dismissed the tin roof signal now lay in a field hospital with punctured lungs and shattered ribs. The incident forced a reckoning. Booth submitted a second report, this time with corroborating testimony from Greaves and 2 other NCOs. He included dates, locations, and outcomes. He described Osmond's system in detail. He argued that the tin roof code had successfully warned 2 patrols and that ignoring on the third had resulted in casualties. The report reached a staff colonel named Wren, a meticulous officer who had spent years in India and understood the value of irregular intelligence. Wren read the report twice. Then he dispatched an intelligence officer, Captain Milbank, to interview Osmond directly. Milbank arrived at the compound with a translator and a notebook. He asked Osmond to demonstrate the system. Osmond climbed onto the roof and tapped out each pattern he had used. Milbank recorded them. He asked about consistency, reliability, and how Osmond determined guerrilla presence. Osmond explained that he listened. He watched. He knew the jungle sounds. He knew which birds went silent when men moved through. He knew the smell of gun oil and the cadence of boots on soft earth. He knew the difference between a farmer walking home and a fighter moving into position. He had lived in that jungle his entire life. He could read it the way Milbank read maps. Milbank pressed him. "How can you be certain?" Osmond looked at him and said, "Because if I am wrong, you ignore it. If I am right, you live. The choice is yours." Milbank returned to headquarters and briefed Wren. Wren made a decision that defied doctrine. He authorized the use of Osmond's tin roof system as supplementary early warning for patrols operating near the compound. He did not formalize it. He did not distribute it widely. He told 4 patrol leaders, including Booth, that if they heard the pattern, they were authorized to alter route or abort movement at their discretion. No questions asked. No justification required. It was a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the best intelligence comes from the least expected sources. Wren understood that wars were not won by doctrine alone. They were won by men who adapted, who listened, who recognized value even when arrived in forms that defied procedure. Over the next 8 months, Osmond tapped 17 times. Each time was a calculated risk. Each time required him to climb onto that roof in the darkness, exposed and vulnerable, knowing that if a guerrilla sentry happened to be watching, if a villager mentioned the tapping to the wrong person, if the British made a mistake of acknowledging him publicly, he and his family would be executed. The terror was constant. The weight of it never lifted. But he continued, because the alternative was worse. The alternative was to let men walk into death when he had the power to warn them. 14 of those 17 warnings were heeded. 13 resulted in confirmed guerrilla presence along the original route. Patrols altered course. Ambushes were avoided. Lives were saved. 1 warning was inconclusive. The patrol changed route, but found no evidence of enemy activity. It might have been a false alarm, or the guerrillas might have relocated after hearing movement. 3 warnings were ignored by commanders who did not believe in the system. 2 of those patrols made contact and took casualties. The 3rd avoided ambush by accident when a supply delay changed their timing. The numbers spoke for themselves. But officially, the system did not exist. There were no commendations, no formal recognition, no inclusion in after-action reports that went beyond regimental level. Because admitting that a Malay civilian with a tin roof and a river stone had created a more effective early warning system than radio intelligence or aerial reconnaissance would have been an embarrassment, the guerrillas eventually noticed. By late 1951, insurgent commanders in the area began questioning why British patrols were avoiding their ambush sites. They suspected informants. They interrogated villagers. They watched the compound. But they never connected the sound of the warnings, because the sound was dismissible. A loose sheet of tin, wind, animals, background noise. It was too simple to be tactical, and that simplicity was its greatest strength. Ahmad, the guerrilla leader, even visited Osman's house once, standing in the doorway and asking if he'd seen British soldiers. Osman said yes, they come through sometimes. Ahmad asked if he had spoken to them. Osman said only to answer questions. Ahmad looked up at the tin roof, heard the wind rattle a loose corner, and walked away satisfied. He never made the connection. The code survived because it hid in plain sight, but the risk was constant. Osman lived in a state of controlled terror. Every time he climbed that roof, he knew he was one suspicion away from execution. His wife Amina knew what he was doing. She begged him to stop. She said the British would leave eventually, but the guerrillas would remember. Osman told her he could not stop. He had already started. If he stopped now, the patrols would die, and their deaths would be his fault. Amina asked what about their children. Osman said if the British lose, the guerrillas win, and the guerrillas do not forgive. The only way to protect the children was to help the British win, without anyone knowing he had helped. It was a gamble, a terrible, necessary gamble, and for 8 months it paid off. In January 1952, the gamble ended, not through betrayal or discovery, but through policy. The British government implemented the Briggs Plan, a massive resettlement program designed to isolate guerrillas from civilian support. Entire compounds were relocated to fortified new villages surrounded by barbed wire and guard posts. The goal was to drain the sea in which the guerrillas swam, cut off their food supply, eliminate their intelligence networks. Osman's compound was scheduled for relocation. Within 2 weeks, his family was loaded onto trucks along with 200 other villagers and moved 30 miles south to a new settlement far from the jungle. The house he had built was abandoned. The tin roof he had used to save British lives was left to rust and scavenge. No marker, no record, no acknowledgement that it had ever mattered. The tin roof system ended. No replacement was established. No attempt was made to replicate it elsewhere. Booth wrote a final report recommending Osman for recognition. He detailed the 17 warnings, confirmed saves, the casualties prevented. He argued that Osman had acted with extraordinary courage under impossible circumstances and deserved formal acknowledgement. The report was filed and forgotten. No response was ever issued. Booth tried again 6 months later. The second request was rejected with a brief notation. Subject is not a British subject. Service was irregular and unverified. No basis for commendation. Booth stopped trying after that. He knew the system did not care about the right kind of heroism. It cared about the documented kind. And Osman's heroism could not be documented without endangering him. Wren retired in 1953. Milbank transferred to Kenya, where he would apply some of the lessons learned in Malaya to the Mau Mau insurgency. Greaves returned to England and worked in civil engineering. Harrow survived his wounds but left the army on medical discharge. The men who had survived because of the tapping went on with their service, and most never knew the full story. They knew only that Booth had a rule. If you hear the tin roof, you stop. You reassess. You do not question it. That rule saved lives. But the man behind it faded into bureaucracy and silence. Osman bin Latif lived until 1984. He worked as a laborer, a market vendor, and eventually a night watchman at a rubber processing plant in Johor. He never spoke publicly about what he had done. His children knew only that their father had helped the British during the emergency, but not how. They asked once. He said only that he listened when others did not, and that sometimes listening was enough. They did not press him. In Malay culture, there are things that are not spoken about, sacrifices that are understood without explanation. Osman carried his secret quietly, the way he had carried everything else, with dignity, with silence, with the knowledge that some forms of courage are recognized only by those who survive because of them. When he died in 1984, there was no obituary. No ceremony beyond the quiet funeral rites of his family and neighbors. No mention in veteran records or regimental histories. No acknowledgement from the British government he had helped. Just a grave in a village cemetery, marked with a simple stone that gave his name, his dates, and nothing else. The tin roof that had saved 17 warnings worth of lives had been scavenged for scrap metal decades earlier. The compound where it stood no longer existed on any map. The story seemed destined to vanish entirely, lost to time and bureaucracy, and the quiet forgetting that swallows most acts of courage that happened in the shadows. But the men he saved remembered. In 1978, 6 years before Osmond's death, a veteran named Colin Marsh, who had been part of booth patrol during the emergency, began researching the tin roof signals that had altered his unit's route on 2 occasions. Marsh had left the Army in 1954, returned to civilian life in Manchester, and spent decades working as a schoolteacher. But the memory of those nights in the Malayan jungle, of hearing that strange rhythmic tapping, and watching his sergeant halt the column based on nothing but sound, had never left him. He wanted to know who had sent those warnings. He wanted to know if the man was still alive. Marsh traced the story through veteran networks, old patrol logs, and letters exchanged with former comrades. He learned about Osmond. He learned about the mockery, the official dismissal, the lack of recognition. And he learned, through a Malay police contact he had maintained correspondence with, that Osmond was still alive, still living in Malaysia, still working as a night watchman. Marsh flew to Johor. He found the village. He found Osmond, and he thanked him. Osmond was 61 years old by then. His hair was gray. His hands were bent with arthritis. He looked at the English stranger standing in his doorway and did not recognize him. Marsh explained who he was. He explained that he had been part of booth patrol. He explained that the tin roof warnings had kept him alive. Osmond listened. Then he smiled a small, tired smile and said it was just tapping. Marsh said no. It was more than that. It was courage in a form no one recognized, and that made it the rarest kind. Marsh had brought a bottle of whiskey and a photograph. The photograph showed booth patrol, 7 men standing in jungle greens, rifles slung, faces young and unaware how close they had come to dying. Marsh pointed to each man and told Osmond their names. He told him what they had done after the war, who had married, who had children, who had lived long enough to grow old. He told Osmond that every one of those lives existed because of a sound in the night, because one man had chosen to act when silence was safer, because courage, real courage, is not about recognition or reward. It is about doing what must be done when no one is watching, and no one will thank you. Osmond looked at the photograph for a long time. His eyes moved from face to face, studying men he had never met but whose lives he had shaped. Then he folded the photograph carefully and put it in his pocket. He kept it there until the day he died. He never showed it to anyone, but he kept it, and perhaps that was enough. Perhaps knowing that the men had lived, that the choice he made had mattered, was all the recognition he needed. If the story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It is the least tribute we can give to men like him. The tin roof code was never taught, never written into doctrine, never repeated. But it worked. It saved 3 patrols from walking into ambushes they would not have survived. It did so without radios, without encryption, without official sanction. It succeeded because one man understood that sound could be language, that rhythm could carry meaning, and that sometimes the simplest tool is the one no one expects. Osmond bin Latif was mocked for his tin roof tapping. He was dismissed as superstitious, unreliable, primitive. But when the bullets stopped flying and the bodies were counted, the men who listened to that tapping went home, and the men who ignored it did not. That is not folklore. That is not coincidence. That is the reality of how survival works when you are paying attention. Osmond never wore a uniform. He never fired a shot. He never received a medal. But he fought a war in his own way, on his own terms, using the only weapon he had, a river stone and a corrugated tin roof. And for 17 nights in the Malayan jungle, that was enough. The British called it the Malayan emergency because calling it a war would have invalidated insurance policies and complicated colonial politics. But it was a war. 12 years of ambushes, reprisals, burned villages, and bodies left in the jungle. Over 500 British and Commonwealth soldiers died. Thousands of guerrillas and civilians were killed. The conflict reshaped Malaya, leading eventually to independence in 1957. But in the midst of that chaos, in the narrow space between two armies, one man found a way to save lives without taking sides. He did not choose the British because he loved them. He did not oppose the communists because he hated them. He simply refused to let men die when he had the power to warn them. That choice, made 17 times over 8 months, is the kind of moral clarity that no doctrine can teach and no medal can recognize. The irony is that the Tin Roof Code worked precisely because it was dismissed. If the British had formalized it, if they had acknowledged Osman publicly, if they had tried to replicate it across other compounds, the system would have collapsed. The guerrillas would have noticed. Informants would have been identified and executed. The code survived because it remained invisible, a ghost signal that existed in the margin between noise and meaning. Osman understood this instinctively. He never asked for recognition. He never sought payment. He never tried to expand the system. He simply did what he could in the only way that would not get him killed, and trusted that someone on the other side was paying attention. That trust was not misplaced. Booth listened. Greaves listened. And because they listened, men lived. There is no museum exhibit about the Tin Roof Code. No chapter in the official histories. No documentary. No memorial. The story survived only through veteran networks, passed down in private conversations and reunion dinners, a footnote in the oral history of men who knew they had been saved by something they could not explain. The system did not care, but the men did. And in the end, that mattered more than any official record. The legacy of the Tin Roof Code is not in doctrine or medals. It is in the lives that continued, in the children born to men who survived because someone tapped a warning in the night, in the quiet knowledge that wars are not won only by generals and strategies, but by individuals who find ways to act when action seems impossible. Osman bin Latif found that way. He used rhythm and stone and courage to communicate across a battlefield where communication meant death. He did it knowing he would never be thanked, knowing he would never be safe, knowing that recognition would be his execution. He did it anyway, and that is the definition of heroism that no citation can capture, the kind that happens in darkness, that saves lives without witnesses, that accepts obscurity as the price of survival. The tin roof is gone. The kampong is gone. The men who heard the tapping are gone. But the story remains. And as long as it remains, so does the proof that ordinary people can change the outcome of wars with nothing but ingenuity, courage, and a refusal to stay silent when silence means death.